Good morning, everyone. My name is Kayla Mack, and I want to welcome you all to Session 3, Day 2 of the Department of Education's Negotiated Rulemaking with the Affordability and Student Loans Committee. I want to begin today with recognizing the participants from the department, the committee, and the advisors. So first, I'm going to ask that everybody turn themselves on mute so that we get no background feedback. Thank you for that. And if you haven't changed your naming convention already, folks, please do that as we go through the roll call as well. On behalf of the department, our federal negotiator, Jennifer Hong, good morning.
Good morning.
We have from the department's Office of General Counsel, Brian Siegel. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning.
And I believe that we have Ms. Vanessa Gomez joining us from the department to assist us with document sharing and live editing. Good morning, Vanessa.
Good morning, everyone.
All right, thank you, department. Now let's recognize our esteemed committee members. For the constituency group of accrediting agencies, we have our primary, Dr. Heather Perfetti.
Good morning, everyone.
And we have our alternate, Dr. Michael McComas.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Michael. For our constituency group of dependent students, we have our primary, Miss Dixie Samaniego.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi, Dixie. And I do want to recognize the alternate, Mr. Greg Norwood, who will not be joining us for today. For the constituency group of federal family education loan lenders and or guarantee agencies, we have our primary, Miss Jay O'Connell.
Morning.
Good morning, Jay. And we have our alternate, Mr. Will Schaffner.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. For our constituency group of financial aid administrators at post-secondary institutions, we have our primary, Mr. Daniel Barkowitz.
Good morning and happy holidays, everyone.
And we have our alternate, Ms. Alyssa Dobson.
Good morning.
Good morning. For our four-year public institutions, we have Dr. Marjorie Doreen Williams.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Marjorie. And her alternate, Ms. Rachel Feldman, will be joining us later today. For independent students, we have as our primary Ms. Michaela Martin.
Good morning. I'll be on camera shortly.
Okay, thanks, Michaela. And we have our alternate, Dr. Stanley Andres.
Morning, everyone.
Morning, Stan. For constituency group of individuals with disabilities or groups representing them, we have our primary, Ms. Bethany Lilly.
Morning, everybody.
Good morning. And we have our alternate, Mr. John Whitelaw.
Good morning.
For our constituency group of legal assistance organizations that represent students and or borrowers, we have our primary, Ms. Persis Yu.
Good morning, all.
Good morning. And our alternate, Mr. Joshua Rofinger.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. For the constituency group of minority serving institutions, we have our alternate who has served as our primary throughout the sessions, Ms. Noelia Gonzalez.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning. For the constituency group private nonprofit institutions, we have our primary, Miss Misty Sabuni.
Morning.
Good morning. And we have our alternate, Dr. Terrence McTeer Jr. Good morning. For constituency group of proprietary institutions, we have our primary, Miss Jessica Berry.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. And our alternate, Dr. Carol Colvin. Good morning, Carol. For state's attorneys general, we have our primary, Mr. Joseph Sanders.
Morning, all.
Morning. And our alternate, Mr. Eric Parr.
Morning, everyone.
For state higher education executive officers, state authorizing agencies, and or state regulators, we have our primary, Dr. David Tanberg.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, David. And our alternate, Ms. Suzanne Martindale.
Hey, good morning.
Morning. For our constituency group of student loan borrowers, we have our primary, Ms. Jerry O'Brien Losi. Sorry, Jerry.
That's all right. Been called worse. Good morning, everybody.
Me too, but I won't share that. And our alternate, Ms. Jennifer Cardenas, I believe, is joining us a little bit later. For the constituency group of two-year public institutions, we have our primary, Dr. Robert Ayala.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Morning. And our alternate, Dr. Christina Tangalakis.
Good morning.
Morning. For the constituency group of United States service members, veterans, or groups representing them, we have primary, Mr. Justin Hoschild.
Morning, folks.
Morning, Justin. And our alternate, Ms. Emily DeVito.
Good morning.
Morning. And for our State DOCs, we have Ms. Ann Precythe.
Good morning.
Good morning, Ann. Thank you to the committee members. I believe we've done our full roll call. Now we move on to our two esteemed advisors. For PSLF, we have Ms. Heather Jarvis.
Good morning.
Good morning, Heather. And for economic and/or higher education data, we have Dr. Raj Doralia.
Morning.
Good morning. Okay, to round out the introductions, I'll remind you of your FMCS team. My name is Kayla Mack. I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues, Ms. Cindy Jeffries. Good morning, Cindy.
Good morning.
Mr. Brady Roberts.
Good morning, everyone.
And Mr. Kevin Hawkins.
Morning, all.
Thank you. All right, just a few reminders. If you have not already fixed your naming convention, it looks like most, if not all of you have, please do so now. When you're not speaking, we ask that you remain on mute just so that we can minimize background noise and distractions. And at this time, I would like to invite only those folks who are participating at the main table to remain on screen and on camera. We are going to have public comments today. Folks are signing up for today, tomorrow, and Thursday. There will, in fact, be no public comment on Friday afternoon because at that time we will be concluded. And lastly, we do want to thank everybody for their efforts yesterday and congratulate you all on your successes yesterday. To recap, the committee was able to reach consensus on 2 issues. We did have productive dialogue around 2 additional issues, and we're close to consensus, but we do have a single blocker on 2 of those issues. So we do hope to revisit those and to continue to work towards consensus on those issues as we're able and as appropriate. We're going to continue asking you all to work towards consensus today, which is the aim of good faith efforts in the negotiated rulemaking process. So keep in mind when we get to those checks, they will be official consensus checks, and we'll make sure that everyone is clear on what we are taking consensus on at that time when we get there. All right, we're going to pick up with IDR today. We had just started. Jennifer had walked us through the first 2 pages and we were opening up for comment. As we work through the IDR paper, we are going to chunk it out. So keep in mind, we would ask that your comments and questions be related to the 2 pages or how we continue to chunk that paper out. At the end of the discussion, though, we will be taking 1 consensus check on the entirety of that issue. Jennifer, is there anything that you would like to share around those first 2 pages to get us started before I open it up to comment?
I could just do a quick refresh. Basically, we're looking at the IDR document and we're looking at definitions regarding, beginning with discretionary income. And just recall some of these definitions don't necessarily apply to the proposed new IDR plan. We've put everything under 1 section to kind of better streamline and organize the information. I just want to point you again to page 2 where we're talking about monthly payment or the equivalent. Again, I just want to emphasize we've included the deferments and forbearances to count as monthly payments, and those are enumerated later in the document. We've also created a process to address the forbearance steering. Again, that's later in the document, but it's referenced here under monthly payment or the equivalent. And again, just to point out at the bottom of page 2, partial financial hardship was just some wordsmithing. Nothing has changed substantively in that section. So that's as far as we got. I know many of the comments are kind of about the proposal generally, but I'm happy to move on, but I see hand raised, so I'll pause there.
Okay, I just want to note that I believe Carol is in for proprietary institutions and it looks like Stan is in for independent students. I noted yesterday at the conclusion of our session, Persis, your hand was up, and Marjorie, your hand was up as well. So if you ladies want to begin the dialogue today, raise your hand. Persis, you already have, so I'm going to begin with you, please.
Thank you. And since we're kicking off, I wanted to somewhat relate this conversation back to a lot of the public testimony that we heard yesterday. We heard, a lot of public service workers who expressed a lot of frustration about the fact that they weren't getting the benefits of the public service loan forgiveness program despite meeting the spirit of the program. And what I wanted to say as we start the income during payment dialogue is that if you really peel back, and I think that's our job here, right, as policymakers, to peel back on the stories of the folks who are not getting the relief, but why are they not getting the relief? And underlying a lot of these problems were really income during payment problems. They're manifested through the fact that they didn't qualify for public service loan forgiveness, but really we're talking about IDR failures, right? We heard people talk about the fact that the IDR payment was not affordable, which is why they had to take forbearances, or we heard about the fact that they were steered into these forbearances and they're not getting credit for these. These are IDR problems, and in order to fix the fundamental problems with PSLF, we really fundamentally need to fix the problems with income during payment. We cannot do this piecemeal. They're all connected. But I think, and so first of all, just to say, like, our public service programs absolutely need to work for public service workers, but we also need IDR to work for the folks who are not able to show up for public testimony. My clients are restaurant workers, my clients are grocery store workers, and they don't qualify for public service loan forgiveness, and they need IDR to work. They need an affordable program that's going to count the time that they've been in repayment to work for them. I think it's worth thinking about why are people struggling so hard to get shoehorned into public service loan forgiveness? And it's because IDR does not work. And we need a program that is working for all borrowers meaning borrowers with graduate loans, borrowers with Parent Plus loans, borrowers who are in public service and borrowers who are not in public service because they need to send money to family members who are not in their immediate family. So we need these programs to work. I appreciate all of the public testimony, and I think we need to take that back to us with this discussion. Just as a technical note, I find the way that we're scrolling through especially the IDR regs to be a little challenging because we have things, right? We're talking about how we count payments, but that's really talked later on.
30 seconds.
Marjorie dropped in the chat, and I'll let her, since she's speaking up next, speak more to this, but I thought she had an excellent proposal on how to discuss these topics in a way that was more comprehensive for each of the discrete topics when we're talking about the payment amount, or we're talking about time to cancellation. I think that makes a lot more sense, and I, of course, will defer to her to speak more to that point. Thank you.
Thanks, Persis. Marjorie, why don't you walk us through that?
Sure. And so now, of course, I'm like, where did I do with the list? But I think to second Persis's point is that while we understand the goal is about the language in the text, we need to have a conversation about the issues that the language in the text is addressing. And so I'll say specifically, and I want to call back to something that you said yesterday, Jennifer, about education being a ticket to the middle class. And I think that we all agree. I think the folks who have called in to give public comment agree that the goal of an education is to look for social mobility, is to advance individuals in terms of their careers, in terms of family and lifetime outcomes. However, I'm really concerned about how we're looking at this in terms of equity, and specifically because we received evidence and research and data about the disproportionate impact of student loans and affordability on borrowers of color, in addition to also getting information about the fact that Black borrowers have to get advanced degrees to be on par with their white peers and colleagues. You also cannot go into specific fields and areas related to public service without those advanced degrees, right? We've talked about social workers, for example. We've talked about counselors. We've talked about folks who work in nonprofits and do community work. And we've heard from those individuals as well. And so to me, it's really concerning that there's language in here that distinguishes between undergraduate and graduate degrees when we received evidence, and I would say thank you, Raj, for sharing those documents, right, from scholars who study this. And so we can't say that we understand that education is a ticket to the middle class. We understand that education is something that helps individuals advance, their own life outcomes for their families, for their communities, while at the same time denying those same individuals opportunities for forgiveness and opportunities to engage in a program that's less cumbersome. And so I really think it makes more sense for us to look at this holistically and to talk through the topics and then look back at the regulatory language instead of trying to do this page by page, I think, as we've done for some other issues where because we're talking about singular issues, I think that made a little bit more sense. So again, I want to bring that to the forefront. I think, yes, right, education is a ticket to the middle class. My parents are immigrants to this country. Like they're all people understand that. I think we all know that. But if we're going to create language that excludes students or penalizes them, right, for systemic issues beyond their control, I really think that that's doing a disservice both to this committee and the work and time we've invested in these issues.
Thank you, Marjorie. Jerry, I see your hand, please.
Marjorie rocks. That was exactly. I just want to add a couple more examples to what she was saying. When we talk about healthcare workers, when we talk about they all need graduate degrees. We know there's a healthcare shortage right now, and we're not going to be having people who work for for-profits in the PSLF program. We're cutting off our future nurses, doctors, all who need advanced degrees, plus the people who teach and train them. And I also want to put out the working poor. Most K through 12 teachers need to have advanced degrees. People running daycare centers have to have advanced degrees in many places. And I think that we do a disservice by not including them into the mix of what we're talking about.
Thank you, Jerry. Daniel, please.
Yeah, so I think one of the concerns that you're hearing, Jennifer, and I would echo this, is that I feel this proposal is a lot of tinkering around the edges, but not really a broad scale reform of income-driven or income-based repayment plans. I'll put a proposal on the table. I wonder, and I struggle with the idea that the time to forgiveness is as long as it is. We say to our public service colleagues, those who work in public service, you have 10 years. You can earn income and work for 10 years, and we'll forgive your loans after 10 years of public service. That makes sense to me. I'm now a beneficiary of that thanks to what came through the waiver, and I appreciate that dramatically. But I would also say, I feel badly for my colleagues who aren't working or who are struggling to, be in a livable wage, that we're saying to them, your 10 years aren't as valuable. Your 10 years of living in that really should be 20 or 25 or longer. And so, I would argue that as a starting frame, we've set an expectation of 10 years. I would love to see 10 years of forgiveness or 10 years to forgiveness for those who have limited income. Because, carrying that burden for 20 or 25 years is more than life altering, it's trajectory altering. And so, that as an example, I think would be a strong statement of equity that could alleviate this. I'm curious, and I don't know if this data is available, but if the department is looking at the amounts of income of those who are now getting forgiveness out of the new PSLF waiver, I would venture to say it's much higher than the group that would ultimately get forgiveness out of this income-based repayment plan. And with that, I'll put my hand down. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. David, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just a huge +1 to everyone that's spoken before me, and to, I'd ask the department to look at what Joe has put in the chat. I think he did a really good job of summarizing where the committee is on this, and I'll profess my disappointment. I think the department's come back with some really great recommendations on so many topics. On this one, I think we had expected the department to swing for the fences, and instead you went for a single. And I think there's some really clear areas where we could greatly improve the proposed changes. And like I said, Joe summarized those. I'd like to pick up on something that Marjorie brought up in regards to Black borrowers seeking graduate degrees. I think one of the primary roles for public policy is to address where the greatest inequalities and abuses exist. And there is significant evidence that many proprietary institutions in particular recognize the desperation and desire of so many Black Americans who are seeking a better life, knowing that they need a graduate degree, and are then handed a ton of debt, inferior products, and almost no way to effectively pay it off. That abuse of desperation is just sickening to me. And the fact that we would not address that now when we have this opportunity, I think is unconscionable. I think we have to add graduate debt to what we're doing here, because the evidence, the facts, the stories, all are calling for us to do that. And I wanted to highlight that, but I would speak just as passionately about each of the proposals that Joe put in the chat. All of them, I think if we don't do it now, it's like when. These are clear wins for all of our constituencies.
Thank you, David. Bethany, please go ahead.
I maybe should pause because I'm just going to jump in like Daniel did on one of the proposals in the chat. And I don't know if we want to go through the whole document before we jump into the different topics, or I realized after I put my hand up, I should ask that question before I started talking.
Sure, and that's what I was considering as well. I think we heard yesterday the idea or suggestion that we chunk this out. But I think what I'm hearing today is it may make sense to instead go through the document comprehensively and then unpack some of the issues here. So department, let me ask you, Jennifer, are you comfortable walking through the entirety of this paper and then we circle back for comments and questions?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm prepared to do that.
Then let me turn it over to you to do that.
Okay.
Thanks for pausing, Bethany.
So thank you all for your comments thus far. I'll just go over the whole document. I do want to say at the outset that, this issue of targeted benefits, we've always said at the outset that we're interested in the lower income, lower balance borrowers, that we wanted to focus on undergraduate students. I understand that's not to say that graduate borrowers are not important. We have other repayment plans to serve those borrowers, but in trying to address these targeted benefits, we feel like the marginal rate, and I'll get into that, really gets to the issue of making more targeted benefits available to everybody. That way we can address the lower income borrowers, those working towards an undergraduate degree, those that are more likely to go into default, which is exactly the issue that we're trying to address through this proposed plan. So on page 3, so left on page 2, on page 3, in the middle of page 3, if we could cue the document. One of the things that we are permitting here, and we're making explicit in the regulation, is that we're allowing a borrower in default to use the IBR, because doing so allows them to also make progress toward forgiveness, and we can't do that in this new proposed plan under the ICR plan. So we've made that explicit in the reg that regardless of whether the borrower is in default on the loan selected for repayment under the plan, they will be able to make their payments count on IBR. So that's one point we discussed. Again, under D, we landed to focus on undergraduate loans. We've had so many presentations to kind of figure out which levers to pull. There's been direct questions of what the parameters are. What are we focusing on? How can we focus and target benefits while addressing kind of broader issues, a broader population? And where we landed was we needed to focus on undergraduate students, and we really need to address the first entry level degree, and with the idea that the other payment plans can address graduate loan debt. Okay, going to page 4, that whole section is highlighted just again because it was reworked. Understand Joe had suggested that we mirror treatment of married borrowers to pay. We've put it along with repay And that's the combined income of the borrower's spouse is used in the calculation in all cases, regardless of whether the borrower's spouse file a joint federal income tax return or separate. So we're marrying that with repay in the proposed language. And then again for EICR, along with all the other IBR or IDR plans, spouse's eligible loan debt is included for purposes of adjusting the borrower's monthly payment amount as described in paragraph G. And then under Romanet 2, for ICR, spouse's loans are eligible for repayment under the ICR plan in accordance with paragraph D2 of this section. And that's on the ICR plan. Okay, there's just some minor changes on page 5. And then let's go to section 5 at the bottom of the page, because I know a lot of people had comments on this. So we are using an income exemption to equal to 200% of the federal poverty level, which is approximately $25,000 for a single individual. Again, we've landed on a marginal rate. We feel like these targeted benefits can be made available to everybody to calculate payments. So you pay nothing from 0 to 200% of the poverty level. Then when you get from 200 to 300%, it's 5% of the income share, and then 10% of amounts over that. So in the example provided, it is a marginal rate. Someone earning $60,000 as a single individual, they would have the income exemption for the $25,000, pay 5% on $13,600, and then 10% on $21,000, which would lower their total payment on the plan from $230 to $232, whereas it would normally be $339 on most IDR plans. So I know that there was questions about making the income protection higher. We landed at 200. I think from Raj's presentation, again, we saw that, you know, as income protection increases to higher levels, the benefits were largely accrued to higher income borrowers. So in order to address and target these benefits to the population that we want to, while making them available to everybody, we feel like this marginal rate addresses a lot of the concerns. So that is how the monthly payments are calculated. Again, it brings down, everybody's paying less. Let's see. Yeah, I'll just leave that there, and then but I think that's kind of like the centerpiece of a lot of the comments that came across yesterday and this morning, so we can revisit that, and maybe Raj can, you know, talk about what this means, give us some examples in terms of the marginal rate. On page 6, you'll see a lot of highlight there. The main issue is under interest subsidies on a $0 payment. Will, due to their income, have all unpaid interest forgiven. And that is on the page, on the bottom of page 6. So for a $0 payment, we will pay the interest in subsection 4. Okay. Page 7. I know, again, we talked about years to forgiveness. So what we're proposing, where we landed on forgiveness under K, there you go, Vanessa, is 20 years. And so We explored the 10 years that was proposed. I know we discussed a lot of that at the previous session. And this is where we landed. I don't know. I don't have much more to say about that, but it's 20 years to forgiveness. And just at this point in time, we're not comfortable with going back to the 10. I know Michaela had a lot of concerns regarding the 20-year forgiveness timeline. Separately, we did look into monthly cancellation or incremental or annual cancellation of loans. And OGC can talk more about that, but we feel like we don't have the legal authority to do the cancellation. So that is the language that we have there. I can get, Michaela, did you want to comment there? Or did you want me to keep going here?
Yeah, you mentioned that, like, 20 years is where you landed through like a lot of conversation. I was just wondering if you were willing or able to provide like why that was 20, like just why, really.
Jen, I don't know if you have an immediate response to that, and I know that more hands are going to come up. I would like to ask that we allow Jennifer to just walk through the rest of the document, and then I invite any and all hands for comments and questions.
Thanks, Kayla. I'm close to being done here. There was a question. Okay, so that is 20 years to forgiveness for EICR. Page 8. So we've added some additional deferments, and we have forbearances. We have mandatory and administrative forbearance. That was actually in there before. We've added a cross-reference to pick up periods of national emergency, as well as issues like when a loan is transferred. So again, we've added rehab training program deferment, unemployment deferment, and post-active duty student deferment. So all these count toward monthly payments. So, I mean, I realize I'm hearing your comments, and I don't want you to dismiss this. I mean, it's lower payments every month. And it is an attempt to try and both target the borrowers that we want to target. We've said from the outset what we were interested in. We're interested in those lower balance, lower income, working toward an undergraduate to keep them from going into default, to help them ensure completion of their degree, while addressing the higher balance borrowers as well. I think that the marginal rate does that. And we've included additional deferments to count as monthly payments. In addition to that, we have addressed the forbearance steering issue explicitly in the regulation. Okay, so the next comment in the middle of page under subsection 5, Romanet 5. The language about if a borrower consolidates one or more direct or FFEL loan into a direct consolidation loan, the payments the borrower made on the direct or FFEL loans prior to consolidating, and that met the criteria in paragraph 4 of the section, 682.209A66 or 682.215 will count as qualifying payments on the direct consolidation loan. Okay, so what does that mean? That means the language allows payments made on IDR to not reset if a borrower consolidates direct loans. Similarly, borrower payments on FFEL that are on the standard repayment plan on IBR can keep counting if the borrower consolidates onto DL. That's a big issue. That is a real big issue for borrowers, so that we're not resetting the clock on consolidation. All those previous payments will count toward forgiveness. Okay. Again, we can't we can't count defaulted borrowers on, we can't put them on ICR. So we want to make sure that they count the payments made on IBR while in default toward forgiveness. Department's read is that we can't do it on ICR, and we're proposing to make borrowers in default eligible only for IBR to ensure that their $0 payments count toward forgiveness. Again, for the IBR plan, a payment made pursuant to K4I through 3I on a loan in default is also considered to satisfy a monthly repayment obligation for the purposes of forgiveness under paragraph K. Another big change, right? Inclusion of defaulted borrowers in IBR and counting those $0 payments toward forgiveness. I think that's significant. Again, another significant change. We have inserted a hold harmless process that would allow any borrower who has spent time in a deferment or forbearance to make up for those months by making the payment they would have otherwise made. This includes a $0 payment if the borrower would have been eligible for it. So again, we're not going to go and explore, what happened. Did the, does a borrower need to prove that they have been steered? No, we're just going to do it. We're going to make this, and we put it in regulation. So we always have the authority. We've said this before. We've always had the authority to make the account correction. I realize then that's, kind of limited to borrowers that have the wherewithal to call and, have to deal with this issue about forbearance steering. Well, now it's in regulation, and now we will count that. We're saying assertively that we will count those payments that you've been on forbearance. We'll count them toward forgiveness. If you're defaulted borrower, you have $0 payment, we'll count those payments. So I think I don't want these big wins to be dismissed by you all. I understand we want the grand plan to address all borrowers, but there is some prioritizing that we have to do, and if we can lower the payments for the most needy borrowers, and we can carry that benefit through higher income, higher balance borrowers, I feel like we can achieve that through the marginal rate that we're proposing from 0 to 10% of the income share. I see a lot of hands. I'm keep talking. 2 more pages, guys. Everything else here you see on page 9. These are largely technical revisions. And then at the very end, bottom of page 10, automatic enrollment in an IDR plan. Okay, we talked about this a lot. So we're proposing that someone who goes 80 days late be put onto IDR plan if it can get the necessary data to calculate a payment. So again, this is to avoid negative credit reporting. So and we're proposing something similar for borrowers in default so long as we can obtain their consent. Okay, and that's under M at the very end, automatic enrollment in an IDR plan. And that, again, another issue that we had talked extensively about to keep these borrowers out of default and to ensure that their $0 payments count for monthly forgiveness. So just to summarize the high points here, we've got putting the borrowers, defaulted borrowers on IBR, counting those $0 payments toward forgiveness. EICR is going to address undergraduate loans. We want to have a plan exclusively for undergraduates. So that is what this proposed plan is seeking to address. We're mirroring the treatment of married borrowers to that of repay. Marginal rate, 200%, beginning with 200% of income exemption. And then again, 5% for 0 to 200 to 300% of the poverty level, and then 10% for any amounts above that. And then paying all, forgiving all interest on $0 payments, 20 years to forgiveness, and the inclusion of additional deferments and forbearances, to include national emergencies, also counting payments, again, for defaulted borrowers, hold harmless procedures for forbearance steering to count those payments toward forgiveness as well. And then finally, automatic enrollment in IDR. In summary, and I see a lot of hands.
Thank you for walking us through that, Jennifer. I too see a lot of hands, and it looks like in the chat, everyone's sort of organizing the thoughts. I'm going to invite questions, comments, concerns, and ideas. I just want to keep us focusing on working towards consensus. So let's keep that in mind in terms of what that might take. David, I want to invite you to kick us off.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. I appreciate your presentation and the work of the department. I would say in baseball, a single is certainly something to celebrate. And I think this is definitely what's been proposed is an improvement over what existed, no doubt. I guess the big broad question I'm left with is, you've said you felt the need to prioritize and to focus, and I don't understand why when we could do more. So what's the underlying motivation to restrict it and to prioritize? This is a sincere question. I don't understand that. What's the risk that I don't see that you all see?
I think that really gets to the heart of it. So what we've seen through IBR is that the beneficiaries of the IBR are higher income, higher balance borrowers. So we're losing out on the neediest borrowers and keeping them out of default. We want to shine a light and we want to serve those students. That's the issue. We want to keep them out of default, and we want to ensure that borrowers that are working toward an undergraduate degree have the support that they need, and that they'll finish and stay out of default.
I agree with
we serve the high balance borrowers really well. The higher income, higher balance borrowers seem to be the biggest beneficiaries of these plans. And that's important. As Marjorie has enumerated, more and more, the graduate degree is important to entering a profession, and we understand all that, and that's why we chose a marginal rate, because we feel like it provides targeted benefits while providing some relief on the payment end for everybody, for all borrowers. But in terms of having to kind of shine a light and focus, we want to keep borrowers out of delinquency, and we want them to finish their undergraduate degree. That doesn't negate everything else that everybody has said here. It's all important.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jennifer. Michaela, please.
Yeah, I first want to speak on the point of how this is like helping students complete their degree, because students who don't typically make payments while they're students, and so I don't think that this affects the likelihood of attaining their degree, because it's usually paused during that time. I think that bringing the payments down is really, really awesome, but 20 years is still too long, particularly when we're talking about a lot of students who maybe haven't actually completed their degree. I've been trying to get my friend Sam to come to public comment. I've had her testify in other spaces that I've been in. We haven't been able to do that, so I'm just going to share a story with her permission. Sam's husband was deployed and has served multiple tours overseas, and since he's been out of the military and come home, they have had just a string of issues, including having to get him signed up to be receive disability benefits under the VA, which is its home process. During this time, she was also in school. So when he came back, she became the full-time, essentially still single mother now of two, right? Because he needed care, and was the only income provider and had to stop out of school. So now she owes over $50,000 in debt. Her degree she doesn't have. And under this plan, we mapped it all out and she'd owe about $46 a month, which is great. That's totally affordable. But for 20 years, like, and now she's working 3 jobs and she's doing awesome. She's like hustling insurance and she's working like as a receptionist and like she's doing, I mean, like, I'm really proud of her. But she can't get a car. Like, she can't get a loan right now. Like, she's still not making enough to be able to like while their income now is like technically within a rate in which they could afford a mortgage, which would be cheaper than the apartment they're renting, they won't qualify because they have all this debt attached to them. So like, I think that 20 years of like just not being able to imagine yourself living a life in which you get to participate in our like, you know, our society. And then also on the other end, I want to acknowledge that like for folks who have been in default for like a long time, Sam's been in default actually now for like 2 years. We're working on him, trying to get her out of that.
30 seconds.
But that other lending institutions would drop a loan that hasn't been paid on for years because it's just not, at some point it becomes that it costs more money to service that loan and to have people trying to collect that debt than it would be than to just not do it, you know? Like $50 a year for 20 years, like for what? For what?
Thank you, Michaela. Daniel, please go ahead.
Thank you. I've got 3 items and I'll try to do them within the 3 minutes, but if I go long, I'll take my place at the end of the line. So 2 of them are substantive, 1 is technical, and I want to just acknowledge again, I'm tinkering on the edges because that's where we are. I'd prefer not to be, but I want to give feedback to what's out there. So first of all, I want to comment on the calculation of the monthly payment. I appreciate the marginal rate, but I would urge the department to use as a baseline the same eligibility criteria you're using for Pell Grant in the new SAI calculation. In the new SAI calculation, minimum Pell can be offered to someone with 400% of annual income. So I would suggest that we mirror that and go instead of 200, 300 to 250, 400. I think that would go a long way toward alleviating some of my concern about the affordability. Again, it's not saying anyone with 400% pays nothing, but it would, again, help with the marginal assessment so that it would be 5% at the 250 to 400 range and 10% 400 and above. I strongly urge the department to match what's on the Pell calculation table. I think it just helps explain it better and gives it some face validity. On the next page, I have significant concerns about, no, let me back up. I appreciate strongly forgiving interest for 0 payment, but I have significant concerns about not forgiving interest when the payment is less than the interest. So if I pay $1, then my balance continues to grow. If my calculation of my payment is $20 and my interest is $60, you know, it's a very, very high cliff. So my strong suggestion would be to say that interest that is assessed but unpaid due to the minimum calculation under this program would be canceled using your language, so that expands, so that we're not in a situation where we have an accumulating balance for those low balance individuals. And then finally, if I have time, Kevin, I know you're a stern timekeeper, I appreciate it. My technical correction on page 8 is I believe you're missing a letter or you skipped a letter. So under your types of deferment and forbearance, you go from G to I. So I'm not sure if H was removed or if it's missed, but it just seems like there's a technical problem in the lettering. How did I do, Kevin? Oh my gosh, I did it. Okay, so there we go. That was my 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Persis, please go ahead.
Thank you. And I think I wanted to start with a discussion of just the goals as they were laid out by Jennifer. I think there's, you know, preventing default is certainly a laudable goal that I can get behind. It just seems pretty arbitrary how and when the department has decided to apply that goal. For example, Parent Plus borrowers, in my experience and in the people that I've served are struggling, and they have very limited options for income during payment. And the programs are not serving them well. The point that was made before that, graduate borrowers or, can use the other IDR programs. Well, frankly, Parent Plus borrowers cannot. And, we know that this is a huge racial justice issue. And why are we not providing a plan that Parent Plus borrowers will have a pathway to use and get affordable payments? I think we also know, though, that Black borrowers in particular have high default rates, and we also know that there is disparities in that graduate borrowers are disproportionately Black. So this again doesn't make sense. The goals are not aligned with the ways that you've structured it. I very much appreciate. I will go into some of the positives, and then we'll jump in line for some more negatives. I appreciate the inclusion of IBR for defaulted borrowers and ensuring that the time that borrowers make payments on IBR count towards cancellation. I do think that that is a huge improvement. And I encourage you, and I can submit language to this effect, that we also, in terms of what we count towards forgiveness, include payments made while in default, whether they are voluntary, involuntary payments. Expand the idea of this hold harmless to these payments as well. But I do want to point out that this doesn't solve default, right? It does not, under these current regs, stop wage garnishment from occurring. It does not stop tax offsets with the EITC and the child tax credit protected, so those will continue to occur. Folks will continue to have their Social Security benefits. There's more work that needs to be done for defaulted borrowers. They also will not have their Title IV funds restored, eligibility restored. So there is more work that needs to be done for married borrowers. Again, I appreciate in the positives, I think counting towards cancellation for payments made in FEL is a huge improvement and will greatly improve the situation, and in fact is required by the statute. So I think that this alignment with the income-based repayment statute is helpful, and so I will jump back in line. Thank you.
Thank you, Persis. Joe, you have the floor.
Thanks, everybody. I'm just gonna address a single issue. I've been putting a bunch of other stuff in the chat, so I'll confine myself to one issue. I hear the department on their priority of helping low income, low balance borrowers. I agree with David that we should really be thinking bigger, but I'm willing to, in the good faith negotiation, I'm going to meet the department where they are. I'm going to talk about forbearance steering and how to address that. I appreciate the department's inclusion of the hold harmless provision, and I appreciate the effort to try to address this problem. So thank you for the time and effort that went into coming up with that proposal. I think that it falls short of helping the borrowers that you're prioritizing, low income, low balance borrowers, because the administration of that hold harmless concept would seem to be something that's difficult to navigate. So I deal with a lot of these borrowers. State attorneys general deal with a lot of these borrowers. They're the type of people that will file a complaint and just say in general, like, help, I can't make my payment, right? They don't know whether their loans are private or federal. They don't know what repayment plan they're in. They don't know that, they don't know who their servicer is. There's a real lack of information there. And so if you have a program where they have to go back in time and submit information to help figure out what they would have made at some previous time, it seems like a lot of those borrowers are going to fall out of that system the way they've been falling out of the current system. The department expressed to me and others concerns about moral hazard with counting forbearances, that everyone will, just go into forbearance and then get their loans forgiven. And, I'm skeptical that would happen, but I hear the department's concern. And so I put forward a proposal, which I sent over the weekend, that would avoid those concerns, that would target low income, low balance borrowers by looking at a period of consecutive forbearances. So if someone in the past has been in forbearance for more than 24 months, that's somebody who should be in IDR. They have a structural problem making the payment. And if we only count those forbearances retroactively, there are no moral hazard concerns. So I appreciate the department's prospective look. I think it can help, but I think we can do more. And I think that my proposal targets exactly the borrowers that the department wants to. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I do want to acknowledge that Suzanne Martindale has come to the table for State Higher Education Executive Officers. Dixie, I'd like to give you the floor.
Also, first off, my chickens and roosters, they're making noise. I feel very bad. I'm sorry. But really just wanted to plus 1,000 bajillion for like points to what everyone was saying previously. Really wanted to go in hard on asking why there wasn't an inclusion of like a regional poverty guideline. I know previously I've asked about it and kind of what the answer was that there's just like no capacity, and it just kind of seems that like that's always the answer. And it would, for me, in my thought process and my own lived experiences, I think that if the department truly wants to target low-income students, right, or low-income borrowers, I think that it's important to find some way to include understanding at the very least of regional poverty guidelines, mainly because a lot of us, I think, are on like either coast of the country, and we see it every day, right? That like, well, 60K in 60,000 a year in one area is not the same as 60,000 in another, and but also like we see that folks of color also just point period blank to struggle period, trying to make payments, right? And so for me, I think one of the ways that the department could I guess just actually target students who are poor is including understanding of regional poverty guidelines. And I know the answer is probably going to be like, well, we don't have capacity. It's just, I just want to know if there's any chance or possibility that the department is going to include that, because for me, that's something that's like important to me. Obviously, I'm not going to I'm not going to hold consensus on this, but I would want, at least some understanding of it. Because as I see it, just previously, like the answer that I've gotten, it's just not sufficient. And personally, as a student of color, I don't think that's okay for the department to just say, well, we don't have capacity. And instead of actually finding a way to increase capacity and bandwidth of the department to include regional poverty guidelines. So I'll give Jennifer some time to like figure out like an answer, or if there's an answer, but yeah, I just wanted to put that in.
Thank you, Dixie. I do want to acknowledge that Christina has come to the table for two-year public institutions. Bethany, I'll turn it over to you.
So I want to touch on two of the things that have already come up, but since we're talking about the big bucket issues, the first is the length of time to forgiveness. And I mean, I think that the Jim Crow debt report made it very clear how hopeless borrowers of color feel about how long it takes to repay this debt. And I think that that's something that the department, if they are trying to target low-income borrowers, need to think about. And I really think that, people spend 40 to 50 years of their life working, right? And we're asking them to spend half of that repaying debt that they needed to get into the career that they're in, or to the excellent example Michaela put forward, didn't even get a degree out of it. And I think that, those are the borrowers I'm thinking about. These payments are going to be very concentrated during periods of life where people are trying to buy houses, they're trying to raise kids, where they have a lot of additional costs. And I think it's completely unrealistic to keep that number at 20 years. Like that, we're asking for a huge percentage of people's time here. And a big part of why I think people feel hopeless is the bigger picture concerns that everyone has been raising about how complicated the system is. It feels like you're in the middle of a scam, and because it just doesn't make sense how it all works. And I having gone through the public service loan forgiveness piece as a very high income borrower, like, yeah, it feels like a bit like a scam because it's so confusing. And I can only imagine for somebody who doesn't have the resources I do, it feels even more that way. So I really want to urge the department to take another look at that, to think about going to 15 years or 10 years. I think Daniel's arguments around 10 years were very persuasive to me. I also want to touch on the income disregard piece, the minimum there, because, okay, so we're setting it at 200 to 300% right now. The rent for an average basic one bedroom apartment in the United States, and to Dixie's points about geographic diversity, this is very different where I live, this is very different where she lives, is just over $1,000 a month. The average income for somebody at 200% of federal poverty is going to be 50% of their monthly income spent just on rent. And we are asking them to say, then make payments on their student loans on top of that. Like, HUD doesn't even recommend you spend that much money on rent. HUD says you should be spending at a, like maximum 30% of your income on that. And we're asking people spending 50% of their income to pay student loans. I think that's, to be honest, quite ridiculous. I would really encourage Ed to look at going higher than that. If you get up to 300% of federal poverty, that is closer to the 30% mark that HUD suggests. I think that's a much more reasonable number. And so I want to flag, like, this means a lot to a lot of people, and we really need to be thinking about that. And if there's a way to do it geographically, as Dixie said, strong support for that as well, because it is very different for people in DC and people in LA than it is for some. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany. Jerry, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'll also say that I appreciate the changes that have happened. My focus is going to be on the grad loan situation. And just to bounce off what several people have said, to simplify the process, just make it available to everybody. It's simple. If you don't want them to be the same 20 years of forgiveness, 15 years, 12 years, whatever, great. But just be inclusive and include everyone. One of the things that I worry about, and I'm not going to articulate this as well as I would, as others would, is that when people are finishing their undergrad, working on their undergrad and want to do more, they miss out on the grad work. Because at the undergrad, you tend to get state aid, you tend to get federal aid, you tend to get all these other things that help you through your undergraduate degree that you don't see at the graduate level. So people are taking an increase in funding at the graduate level. And I know I hear it in the comments, being concerned about high borrowers and with high loans getting forgiven. I'm not concerned about them. I'm concerned about the people in the middle. I'm concerned about the people who did have clear enough credit to get their Parent Plus loan for their child, but then after that, they're still paying on this loan that couldn't be turned back to the child. It's just because people could have the credit to be able to qualify for a Parent Plus loan doesn't mean that that continues on. And I think we've heard that in the public comment. And the other point, I forgot, the train has left the station. I'm sorry, I'm going to let more articulate people. Marjorie's next. I know she's got this, but just since I'm not out of time yet, just again, simplification is going to be easiest. Not everybody on this call has to sell. I don't have to necessarily sell it to somebody finishing an associate's degree, but I have to be able to explain the program, why they're excluded from a program at a graduate degree. And I'll go back to my last point, and that's about the healthcare workers. We've heard from people who are in for-profit healthcare industries that are the working poor. We've heard from nursing students. We've heard from people who are working with people with autism. We've heard about those things, the social workers that still require a graduate degree to do their work, but their loans are eating that up. And a good IDR program can help eliminate that.
Thank you, Jerry. Marjorie, please go ahead.
Yeah, so Jerry actually took many of the words right from my mouth. My specific question, and I hope there is a answer, is why this policy can't be inclusive rather than exclusive. And so if we simply strike undergraduate and keep it to student loans, I don't see how we're not still serving undergraduate borrowers while at the same time not excluding other borrowers. In addition, while we're seeing national trends of decreased funding for particularly public institutions of higher education, much of that burden gets pushed onto graduate students. So at my own institution, we've cut tuition waivers, we've cut assistantships. And so again, these same students who are undergraduates, who are low income from marginalized populations, go on to get graduate, right? These are the same students. We're not talking about different folks. There are students who are low income backgrounds, who go to undergraduate to get undergraduate degrees, and then continue on to get graduate degrees. And so it's really not clear to me why we can't simply remove that language, because it doesn't mean that we're not still attending to the needs of undergraduate borrowers. I know I'm going to keep harping on this. I know it's just one point, and I think also agree with everyone else. There is a lot here that is helpful in thinking about forbearances, deferments, automation, and those are appreciated. But I really think that exclusionary policies aren't helpful, and then to try and undo it later, I feel like causes more difficulty, both for the department, right? And then there's going to be another committee that's going to have this conversation again. And so I really, really strongly am stressing, can we please just strike that language and make this an inclusive policy? I don't see the harm that that does to undergraduate borrowers, while also benefit graduating borrowers. The second thing is, when we started this process as well, was this goal of, here's a better plan that's more simple and easy to understand. If now I'm a borrower who I have undergraduate loans and graduate loans, now I have to figure out two completely different plans in a system that we already know is beyond confusing and inefficient for borrowers, period. So I think this distinction works against the stated purposes of the department to simplify. It is not inclusive and doesn't address these issues of equity that affect all borrowers.
Thank you, Marjorie. Daniel, please go ahead.
Marjorie, I'm just going to let you drop the mic on that for a second, because so I'm gonna echo and actually add. I wasn't going to comment on this, but I think the point that Marjorie raises about undergrad versus grad. If you think through the normal progression of a student, you finish your undergrad degree. Not everyone goes off immediately to grad school. So that student may consolidate their undergraduate loans, and then they take out graduate loans. What do they do? And, in a sense, is the calculation of the minimum monthly payment double? Because in a sense, they'd be under two different payment plans. So again, I think there are multiple issues of complexity here that I hadn't even thought about, Marjorie, until you just said that I think are really important to address. So is the expectation an undergraduate borrower would then consolidate into a different repayment plan with their grad loans? It just counseling wise, it becomes extremely complicated. The point I was going to raise, and my eyes are on my timekeeper, but the point I was going to raise is the married student issue. And again, I just want to talk for a moment about the public comment that was made yesterday by Professor Hayes from Marymount. I think that was really important to understand. So, if the department is thinking about, and I think you have to think about income-based repayment plans as a feeder to PSLF, because they are connected. You won't get PSLF unless you're on an income-based plan. The difficulty of a married borrower where one spouse is working under public service and the other is not, it becomes very limiting as a factor. And so, for requiring in each of these plans, or even in EICR, to require that students in fact, or borrowers in fact, merge their income and merge their loans, is a disincentive and a disaggregator for PSLF eligibility. So, that's another piece that I would think maybe we want to reconsider, is the idea of having the married borrower's information considered. In her case, and I did some follow-up with her yesterday, she's got a very small loan amount that could be forgiven based on her years of experience, but again, under the wrong repayment plan. And there's no way to go back and recalculate at that point. And that, that's a real loss in terms of the benefit to public service employees. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Persis, please go ahead.
Thank you. And I would like to just go back to the idea of bucketing these somewhat, and the idea of, if we're going to try to come to consensus on any particular issues, it might be easier if we're talking about one issue at a time. Without that, I will dive into the time to forgiveness proposal. One of the stated goals of the department early on was that they wanted low-income borrowers to be able to get cancellation sooner. And so that is something that we, again, don't see in this, that the lowest income borrowers, $0 borrowers, or the, $10, $15, $50, as Michaela pointed out, borrowers are still going to have to do it for 20 years. And that seems untenable. One of the proposals that I made that has not been addressed by the Department of Education is whether or not we can tier the amount or scale the amount of forgiveness by the borrower's income. And I think one can do this on an annual basis. I submitted a proposal. I've talked to some colleagues who have done some more mathing and modeling and can provide a little bit more specific proposal on how one could tier cancellation by income, so that borrowers who have, let's say, make less than 150% of the federal poverty can get cancellation within 5 years, and then and then we can scale it up to 15 or 20 years for the highest income borrowers. But, looking at this idea of how can we peg the amount of cancellation to what the borrower's income is, I think that would be a much more equitable way to target relief, rather than this graduate versus undergraduate distinction, or plus versus not plus. I think that there are ways that we can do this that can be responsive to the goals of helping low-income borrowers, while also helping to get them out of debt. Because as we know, only 32 borrowers have received cancellation under income during payment. It's not working. Folks aren't seeing cancellation. And if we peg this plan to another 20 years, we're not going to know for another 2 decades whether or not it worked or not. And that at that point, it's going to be too late, and we've going to lock a lot of borrowers into a lifetime of debt. So I'd like to hear some response in terms of the idea of having some kind of scale with cancellation, and thinking about that as a way that we could target relief, instead of picking and choosing which borrowers we are going to help with this proposal.
Thank you, Persis. I also want to note there's been a number of great questions in the chat as well. I just saw one around statutory authority. I want to encourage you, if the dialogue isn't touching upon your question, to feel free to raise your hand and ask it, to the group, just to make sure that we're getting attention and to each of those questions for the purposes of our dialogue as well. Suzanne, please go ahead.
Great, thank you. So I will endeavor to make points that have not already been explicitly made. So yeah, when I hear targeting, I hear complexity and a theoretical concern over the federal fisc, as opposed to a concern for student borrower success here. And I don't think, as to Persis's point, that anyone's got good enough math upon which to say this is definitely going to work when it's a highly complex program, and we're adding to an already complex ecosystem for student loan repayment. Also, I would be remiss as the state financial regulator if I did not mention that I think any program that you put down on paper, let's remember it's going to be implemented and operationalized by servicers. And we already know all the problems that have already existed with, borrower calling a servicer, and maybe they get a customer service rep for 7 minutes. How are they going to explain this program, the eligibility, what your payments are going to be? I have great concerns about how this could be operationalized and the ways in which it could go wrong. And also, I want to lift up again another point that Michaela made, and to say, in the private credit context, if someone has a $0 payment for that long, I mean, you charge it off, right? I think that there are hidden back-end costs that we're not talking about in terms of servicing and collections of loans that simply cannot be repaid. And so I do think that all these different aspects of this, the the hesitancy to, raise the amount of protected income, the insistence on repayment for 20 years, and also, some limitations on interest capitalization. I think that you could go farther there to cabin the front end costs and then the back end costs to the department. But I do think that we'd be in a much better place if we had a simpler program where borrowers can understand their options and are more likely to engage in the programs and maybe find a modicum of trust in the system. And I think that the increased complexity does kind of tamper the interest in trying this at all. And then we're not really, effectuating the stated goals here of trying to provide access. I will also say very briefly, when we negotiated REPAYE, there was contention around how to determine the repayment periods, and initially the department considered
seconds.
20 years for most people, and then if they borrowed $1 more above $57,500, we were going to make them pay for 25 years. And the department backed off of that. I think they backed away from the notion that we should penalize people with higher balances, and I would just call out that I don't think that we should do that here either. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Michaela, please go ahead.
Yeah. First, I really want to acknowledge that all of us in this space have a lot of privilege by even being in this space, and that well, I'm not receiving any form of compensation. There are a lot of folks that through their work and things do have access to this space because of that, right? And on that when we're talking about making an IDR plan that works for PSLF, and we're talking about how many people we're hearing for PSLF, there's a reason for that, right? Folks who have access to even think about PSLF inherently also have privilege, right? They have a job, they likely already have a degree, and they're doing work that people think of as worthy of forgiveness, right? Which in itself, so just because we're not seeing folks in the comments coming out and saying, hey, I didn't graduate, first off, that's a really, really hard thing to ask of someone, right? The emotional labor that goes into a public comment to come in front of a bunch of people in suits and be like, I didn't graduate and I'm poor and please help me. Not a fun time. Not a fun time. It's a whole lot easier to come and be like, yeah, I'm a hero and I'm trying to get PSLF and I'm going to come comment. So I just want to really, really put that there. And then my question is where are we going from here, right? If this is some type of zero sum game with a limited amount of resources, do we have options? Is this a, if then kind of situation where if we mess with a lever here, or can you give us some on forgiveness, or do we have to make choices? Because I feel right now we all want to have a conversation broadly about these are all the things that we want, but we're also not really being given information on if there's really anything. And my fear with starting piece by piece is that if we don't have any idea of where we can go, then negotiating power, right? And I think that 10 years to forgiveness, I don't think that even lowering it to 10 years would eliminate the need for PSLF, because PSLF is for folks who have, the potential for, and the whole program was just created so that people would be incentivized to go into nonprofit when they could go
30
work
seconds.
in the private sector. And I just we shouldn't talk about IDR as the pathway to PSLF, right? The IDR should be the pathway to forgiveness and a way out of debt, and it's not. In 20 years, that's a really long time. 20 years, I'm 31 right now and I'm going to graduate this year. That means that
3 minutes.
Thank you, Michaela. Joe, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm just gonna kind of make some structural suggestions that I think might help us move towards consensus. First one, I think that there are a number of areas where feedback from the department could help us get towards consensus if we could know what the department was thinking on why they're not comfortable going below 20 years. If we could answer Jay's question that she put in the chat about, authority, right? That will help people understand where the department is and help us move towards the department, right? Good faith negotiation. Along those lines, one of the things the department commented on in the issue paper here was that they had considered monthly or annual forgiveness, but felt they didn't have the authority. I've been doing some reading on authority and was looking at settlement and compromise authority. There's a good memo that was out last week from the Student Borrower Protection Center, which I dropped in the chat, which addresses settlement and compromise authority. And a question that I have in the department is whether that authority could be used to do monthly or annual forgiveness. I take Percis's point that seeing balances go up is a real dissuasion for people to get into IDR. I definitely see that with the complaints that we get to the state attorneys general. So would love to get some feedback from the department. Absolutely happy to work with you guys to try to come towards consensus.
Thank you, Joe. Jay, please go ahead.
Thank you. So I had dropped in the chat the question regarding the counting the underlying FEL payment toward forgiveness and just not understanding the statutory authority because it's never been that way. And my understanding was that that connected to the fact that FEL loans were never authorized under the Higher Education Act for income contingent repayment. So I wanted to understand that. I also had a question on the default piece and IBR for defaults. I was assuming that was DL only, but I wanted to clarify if that is the case. And I could put that question in the chat too. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Persis, please go ahead.
So I was, when Jay posted the question in the chat, I've been frantically trying to search for the statutory authority because I concur with the department on its legal authority to include underlying FEL payments. I believe in fact, I don't have the statute in front of me, so I'm doing this from memory, so forgive the slightly clumsy way of doing this. But the income-based repayment statute, in fact, says that any payments a borrower makes under the IBR plan shall count towards cancellation. And so to my mind, because it's about a borrower and not about a payment made on a loan, which is distinct from the way that PSLF counts payments, where that's talking about payments on a loan, but in the IBR statute, it explicitly talks about payments made by a borrower under the IBR statute, which to me says that it doesn't matter whether or not the loan has been consolidated or not, that those payments have to count. The income contingent repayment is quite broad in terms of what can count. And so I believe that there is good legal basis for counting the underlying payment, the payments made on a FEL loan that have then been consolidated into a direct loan for both the IBR program and for the ICR statute. I'm happy to go back over lunchtime to actually dig out those statutes and point to the precise language. But I do want to talk more about the interest piece and one technical question that I have, because Jennifer, when you discussed how we're treating interest subsidies for $0 payments, you said that all interest for $0 borrowers would be paid by the department. Whereas I believe, as I read the statute, and tell me if I'm wrong, that it's only on the subsidized loans portion of the interest. And so even $0 borrowers with $0 payments in EICR would still owe interest on their unsubsidized loans. And I think this again leads to a layer of complexity for borrowers where, because REPAY covers some amounts of unpaid interest, but it doesn't distinguish between subsidized and unsubsidized, it would be nearly impossible for a servicer to walk a borrower through which program is actually going to be most advantageous for them. And I think that's a huge problem, that even a borrower under, the threshold where with a $0 payment can't distinguish which plan is better, I think is a huge problem. But I think more problematically is fundamentally
30 seconds.
that the interest subsidy creates. And I think that all unpaid interest needs to be subsidized. The fact that balances continue to grow is a huge problem, and it leads to a debt trap because, again, you're talking about 20 years forgiveness. Too many people fail, and when they fail, that interest becomes something that they have to pay, and they're going to pay them through their child tax credits, through their earned income tax credits, through their Social Security benefits. And so that's a huge problem for low income defaulted borrowers in particular, who are the population that you claim to want to protect in this plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Persis. I want to welcome Alyssa to the table on behalf of financial aid administrators at post-secondary institutions. Carol, please go ahead.
Thank you. Would it be possible for the department to consider not the level of education, but to possibly restructure that language to use an original loan cap amount for subsidized and unsubsidized loans borrowed to better address the inequities that we're discussing? I would suggest considering a cap of the undergraduate loan limits, the 57.5 that we're aware of, plus the equivalent of 2 years of graduate level unsub loans, which is $20,500 per year, or at least ask that the department consider the undergraduate aggregate loan limit cap of 57.5, which would still afford the department the same protection against high balances that they're seeking, but it would take into consideration low-income borrowers who were full Pell eligible and possibly able to complete an undergraduate degree without exhausting their aggregate loan limits. As previously mentioned, the rationale for removing graduate students is the expectation that graduate level education has the ability to move them to middle-class income. However, we know that it's less likely for students of color, and unfortunately, it does not address at all the situation where graduate education is started but never completed. I believe that if unable to allow for graduate level loans as a whole, this may allow for at least some consideration of those disparities that exist amongst students of color, while obviously not resolving the issue, but also ask for consideration of forgiveness at 15 years, as I believe that was approved by the prior administration, which I think would indicate that it's feasible, and then using a tier past that point as Persis suggested.
All right, thank you, Carol. Any other comments, questions at this time? Okay. Here's what I'd like to suggest. Why don't we take a quick 5-minute break, come back, invite any more questions or comments, and then I'd like to invite some feedback to the from the department, as we've had a number of questions and solicitations for some thoughts from the department, and we'll do that before we move into a consensus check before lunch. All right, so I have mine 11:28. Let's come back at 11:35 and we'll pick right up here. All right. Thank you all. I hope you were able to step away and enjoy a bit of a break. I want to pick up in the conversation just where we left off. We've gone through a number of comments, questions, ideas from the committee, and there have been some requests for some feedback from the department. So Jennifer, I would like to invite that at this time if you have feedback to some of the concerns and questions that have been raised by the committee.
So I know that there was a lot of questions regarding the 20 years to forgiveness. I will say that the main point of this proposed plan is that we've lowered monthly payments significantly. And just as a reminder, I mean, this is a repayment plan, right? I mean, the statutory is not explicit about forgiveness. It's the interpretation that the department has made over the years, and we've included that. And we felt like 20 years, if we could lower the payment significantly, which I think we've achieved through this proposal, that 20 years is a reasonable time frame. I hear the concerns regarding the time frame, and we found that it was less of a concern given the fact that we are able to lower the monthly payments so significantly and save the borrower, target the borrowers, the lower income borrowers, but also those benefits apply across the board through this marginal assessment. So that is one point. I just want to emphasize again that we've included deferments and forbearances, months when borrowers have been steered into forbearances. We've made that explicit in the regulation. And to Joe's point, the language that we've proposed, and again, we are looking at the language, the retroactivity language that you're proposing for the forbearance steering. However, we feel like our proposal addresses it both ways. And I think we have to keep it in there for prospective instances as well. So we stand by that process and the fact that we have the authority to make those account corrections for borrowers that have been steered into forbearances. Again, the inclusion of defaulted borrowers can use IBR, count $0 payments toward forgiveness. The issue with the income protection, again, on increasing it, I will say that when we talked about this in the past, again, we've noticed that there's little to no marginal benefit as income protection gets higher for the lower income borrowers. And so by doing the marginal assessment, I think we're capturing a lot in terms of both, again, the targeted and everybody else in terms of saving money monthly, every month on the payments that they're making. Again, 200% of income protection up to the poverty level. And then a marginal assessment thereafter, 5% for 200 to 300, 10% everything thereafter. Persis, you're right, the subsidy on the unpaid interest is limited to direct subsidized loans. We won't reset payments if the borrower consolidates. That's to the extent that Jay's questioning our authority to be able to do that. And I'm going to have Brian talk about that authority as well when I finish. Again, count payments on IBR while on default. We have the hold harmless procedures and auto enrollment into IDR. So I'll just stop there. I don't know if that addresses some of your concerns. We have some of the questions in the chat. We're happy to loop back, but and I'll pass it off to Brian regarding the piece on authority.
Thanks, Jennifer. Brian, please go ahead.
Okay, as Persis started explaining it, under section 493 C B7 of the HEA, periods in which borrowers in IBR count towards forgiveness. And our regulation, our proposed regulation, would count those periods on a FFEL loan if the borrower then consolidates into a direct loan. Sometimes the department, the department has in the past taken what the borrower did on underlying loans into consideration on the consolidation loan, and sometimes it doesn't. In this case, we are changing it to provide, to count those periods in which the borrower is in IBR on a FFEL loan towards forgiveness once on the consolidation loan. I note that both the IBR statute and section 455 D or E provide that both payments made by a borrower on a 10-year plan, the standard 10-year plan, count toward forgiveness in both IBR and ICR. So the department, under its regulatory authority, is including payments made under an IBR plan or a 10-year standard plan on a FFEL loan towards cancellation of the direct consolidation loan. We figure that's both consistent with our past regulations and consistent with our statutory authority. In regard to your second question about applying default or providing ICR to a defaulted borrower, this is a change to the direct loan regulations. And the direct loan statute specifically provides that the department can require a defaulted borrower to repay under ICR. So we believe that's clearly consistent with that statutory authority. More broadly, the department, when it holds a defaulted loan, works with borrowers in a multitude of ways to try to get a payment plan that works for them. And so we may provide a FFEL borrower what appears to be similar to an ICR plan in an appropriate case when we're trying to collect on the loan.
Okay. Thank you, Department. Jennifer and Brian, I want to acknowledge that David's come back to the table for state higher education, executive officers, and state regulators. And I want to invite the committee, if there are any additional questions or comments at this time, having heard this piece from the department. Michaela, please go ahead.
Just prior to the break, you said we would just move to consensus. And I'm just wondering if there are any pieces in which, like, is this really like less of a negotiation and more of like, this is what it is and we vote on it now and that's it? Because I just don't feel like that we have, like, I do acknowledge that there's some really great pieces in this and that there were, you know, some expansions, but I mean,
doing a consensus, yeah, let me try to speak to that, Michaela. Doing a consensus check does not mean, in fact, that there's not a negotiation. There's been discussion and negotiation in the prior two sessions, and then we have this paper here. All of the work that's been done thus far has led us to this point. The initial consensus check is to see where the parties are and if they can support what is being proposed. If anyone dissents and expresses a serious reservation, then we pick up with a discussion there. We ask that individual to articulate their serious reservation and what idea or proposal does in fact get them to hear. So it's not an end of the road, but it is a very clear indication of where each of the constituency representatives as part of the committee stand with regard to what is specifically being proposed at this time. Does that help?
Yeah. And then I also just want to again acknowledge that, like, you know, when we're talking about this one, it's like just a pathway to PSLF, or even when we're talking about statutory interpretation, like PSLF, like in there is not limited to like 501c3s and government work. And like we're hearing over and over and over again about how there are other folks that are doing, you know, what we might consider public service. And again, particularly in COVID, where we called, you know, essential workers, right? They are essential to our economy. Like that is a public service, not just even during COVID, but like all labor in the world in which we've created here, you know, is important. And so limiting this to qualification of you can get 10 10 years to forgiveness if you happen to write for an organization that we think is worthy. Even though there are still organizations that are like very controversial that are 501c3s and you can get loan forgiveness under, you know, like the NRA and NARAL, right? Those are like opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Like, but those both get loan forgiveness. But if you work for a for-profit hospital, like, then you don't. Like the way that we're delineating what is worthy in our society is just really, really concerning to me, and it really hurts that in order to get that forgiveness, you have to be good enough. And I wish that we could really challenge that and give a way out of debt and an affordable education to everybody.
Thank you, Michaela. Persis, please go ahead.
I just want to echo, well, I echo both of Michaela's concerns, certainly about the time to forgiveness, but I think more procedurally, the call to a consensus check right now feels very premature. This is the first week in which we've had any language and any actual answers about what the department considered to be the reasonable time towards cancellation, about what they consider to be the repayment amount, this is the first time we've heard about the exclusion of graduate borrowers. This does not feel like a negotiation like we've had with the other topics. I think that income during payment has gotten short shrift in the conversation. And to Michaela's point, there are a lot of people who are really counting on this plan working for them. And we have given it all of one morning where we've actually had language to respond to. And I think that it deserves more time. And I think we deserve to have more time and more feedback from the department.
Thank you, Persis. David, please go ahead.
I just want to bring attention to a comment by Joe in chat. I would love to start working the red lines and trying to compromise on things and negotiate on these points. That way we can find out where the line is for the department, and maybe we can nudge things towards consensus. But if there's a few points and we could just start ticking them down and try to see if there is negotiation to have, that would be great. And if possible, actually change the red lines to reflect any compromise among the committee members. I would just echo that.
Thank you, David. Any other thoughts from the committee that you'd like to share at this moment? Department, do you have any initial feedback based on the suggestions in terms of what's being shared out by the committee members now? Or would you like a moment?
So I mean, I think how you characterized it is good, Kayla. I mean, like this document in front of you is an outcome of everything that came before in terms of our discussion in session 2. So we went back and we considered thoughtfully everything that was raised in session 2, and this is where we landed. It's still a negotiation. We are in the 3rd session. I understand the concerns. I know I keep repeating them. There's some really important changes from sessions 2 and 3 that we wanted to include, but we did prioritize lowering the monthly payment. And I think that is, I think that's important to know, because by lowering the monthly payment, that makes a 20-year repayment timeframe more feasible. And so that is, in terms of the questions of, why 20 years for forgiveness, that's why, because and again, just to keep in mind, this is a repayment plan, and we want to make this work for all borrowers. That being said, we did have from the outset some priorities, some population that we want to focus on, and I think that's important given the different levers that we can pull. And what we found as the income protection grows, that is a marginal benefit, little to marginal benefit for those lower income borrowers. And that really the benefits accrue for higher income borrowers. So we landed at 200%. That being said, I mean, we're open to hearing. I think the purpose of the consensus check is to see what the sticking points are. I feel like I understand it from this conversation. And so, I mean, we can take it, but we are, what is it? It's Tuesday. So I don't know the extent to which or what's being proposed to change. And I would have to go back to see whether we could take it or not take it, but we're still in negotiation here.
Thank you, Jennifer. Justin, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And I might differ from a number of my fellow negotiators here in this proposal, but I mean, I generally support Joe's idea of taking a look at some specific language, but I guess I would just pose the direct question to the department right now on whether or not they're willing to engage in that type of exercise at this point. Because if they're not, frankly, then I just propose we do a consensus check with the hopes that the department comes back to us with updated regulatory text when we circle back on this later this week, so that we can execute on that still being a negotiation. So that, I mean, that's what I would propose. So the direct question to the department is, are you willing to, go forward with any type of redlining right now?
Thank you, Justin. Persis?
So I think I'm happy to do the consensus check if we're going to circle back later. I do think it's worth just reiterating that the stated goals of the department are not what this regulation accomplishes. If this seems pretty arbitrary, given how devoid it is of the data, So, the Treasury did a pilot a couple years ago, looking at defaulted borrowers, and it found that like half of borrowers would have a $0 payment, which says to me that while I don't want to dismiss, I think the payment amount is very important, but it's not the only thing that's making borrowers default. And so this is not responsive to what is making borrowers default. It is not simply the payment amount. The payment amount is incredibly important, and we've heard that time and time again that a lot of people cannot afford the payments, but that is not the only thing given the number of borrowers that we know that default who would have $0 payments under the current plans. And the other piece that I think this is related is when we looked at the data before, we considered borrowers with a $50,000 income to be high income borrowers. So I think we have just a definitional problem right now about thinking about who is a low income borrower, because in most parts of the country, someone with a $50,000 annual income is actually considered low income. So we have basic definition problems, and so I would like to push back on whether or not even the stated goals of the department are accomplished by the regulations that they've proposed.
Thank you, Persis. We are 3 minutes from lunch. Okay, go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, maybe, yeah, I didn't realize how close we are to lunch. So we go to lunch and we could pick back up on this after lunch.
This is what I was going to suggest. I want to encourage you all to think of the consensus check as the committee expressing their agreement or dissent with what is currently being proposed. If we're in consensus, we'll move forward. If we are not, we will invite and ask and basically charge the blockers or the dissenters to providing red lines that would help us get to consensus. So I don't want anyone to think that if we take a consensus check, it prevents the opportunity for red lines and further discussion during this session. I hope that helps. But given that we are so close to lunch, I don't want to push for the consensus check now and would suggest that we come back after lunch and circle back to that. But Jennifer, please go ahead.
Wait, we'll talk more after lunch and I'll go. I just don't want anybody to spend their lunch working on red lines either.
Sounds good. All right, we will return at the top of the hour. Michaela, go ahead.
Sure, I just think a lot of us have already submitted the red lines. Like I did, Persis did, like the folks that you're hearing like most vocally right now. And if someone didn't specifically submit a red line, it's likely because it was already covered in someone else's. So like that red line exists and you have it and it's on the website. Also, like we're not taking a consensus check before lunch, correct?
We're not.
Right now? Okay.
No. Suggested that we come back after lunch and do that, if that works for all of you. Okay, Then let's go to lunch. We'll see you at the top of the hour.